So the big task we're going to do with our photo sharing application for this lesson is we're going to add sort of authentication to it. We're going to demand that the user be logged in to work with those two admin pages we wrote in the previous lesson because we don't want anybody able to just willy-nilly add albums and photos. So unfortunately, this is another one of those cases where I can't enter in all the code live and dynamically because it would take weeks and we would all, well, not weeks, but quite a long time and we would all get bored quite quickly. So I'll enter some code in a few key places and then I'll sort of walk you through the other key, the key parts that we want to work with. So I've made another copy of my photo sharing application here, and I've got the static and app folders like we had before. And one of the things I've already gone ahead and done is I've converted the backend to use MySQL instead of MongoDB like we used in the last lesson. And now the cool thing about the way I've set up this application is that literally I didn't have to touch any of the handlers or anything else at all. I just had to come in here to the backend, modify the DB, and then modify the album class and change from some MongoDB stuff to some MySQL queries, and it all worked right away. So what I need to do here in order to support user authentication is I've actually written a new handler called user handler, and I've put that in handlers users. So let's take a look at that. And you'll see here that I've created a user object like I sort of did for albums and photos before. And I also have this sort of response object filtering function here, which very importantly removes the password. So we want to make sure we never accidentally send down the password hash to the JSON sort of clients. And then the big function here in this is the register function, and then we also do have a login function as well. So let's go here to our server file again, and I need to add two new APIs. On the JSON server API part of things, we need to be able to put a new object into the users collection, and that will be user handler.register. And so that's how you register new users, or you create new users in the system. And then to help us with our authentication, we're going to again kind of have our server double as some crude basic web functionality here. And we're going to let you post to /service login like that. And that will also go to the user handler. And that'll call the login function. Okay. Now, the way we're going to implement user login, or the way we're going to have the server remember the login, is by using session cookies. And if you remember from back in the, I guess it was lesson 7, the way we do lesson is we use the middleware component. For that, we first need to include the cookie parser, and then we need to app.use express.session. Now, this needs a few things, number one of which will be a secret key or something like that. It's very secretive, just something to help us encrypt the session data, or the session cookie, so it's not that easy to figure out. The next is we want to set some cookie values. We're going to set a max age on the cookie of 86,400 times 1,000. So we want the sessions to time out after 1 day. And finally, we do need a memory store for the session, and that will come in the form of a new express.session.memory store object like that. And with that, we should be, let's make this a little more attractive, like that. And with that, we have the session set up, we have the user handler, we have the users.json API, the users JSON API, and we have the sort of login service request here, which will verify that the username and password are correct, and if they are, it'll remember their login status here in the session. So let's go ahead and look at the back end. I want to look at the db.js. And what's going to be a little different here is we no longer have albums and photo collections. All we have is the sort of DB client, or just the DB. So what you'll do is on the DB module, you'll call the DB function, and we'll get you a new connection to the MySQL server. We've gone ahead and changed our local config file for this lesson to be more MySQL-y instead of MongoDB, so we have the host, the username, and password, and the database. The albums file, I'll leave you to look in the GitHub file, the GitHub source, to sort of see how we converted the albums and photos over. What I'd like to do now is look at the users database code instead, because that's completely new stuff. So to register a user, we're going to check their parameters. We're going to make sure they gave us a valid email address, and we're doing a very crude check right now just to make sure there's an @ sign. Then we get a connection to the database. Then we put that connection in a sort of global variable so we don't have to continually pass it through the waterfall. Not a global variable, like a sort of broader scope variable. Then we use this thing called bcrypt hash. We're actually using this bcrypt module, which is a great way to generate passwords because it's just always intentionally slow to do it. So it's hard to crack these passwords because this bcrypt module just is always taking a long time to do its work. To support that, we had to add support here for the bcrypt module like that. In the package.json, we had to mention we're dependent on that. I'm also using this thing called UUID to generate user IDs. I'm not using integer user IDs. For some reason, I've gotten into using GUIDs for these things. So in my dependencies, I also mentioned that I'm dependent on Node UUID here in our package.json. Okay, so once I do that, once I get the hash, once I get the user ID, I insert the user into the users table. I check the results, make sure I got it, and then I actually go ahead and just immediately turn around and fetch this object from the database. The reason I do that is to sort of triple check that everything worked out great, and then also I will get the user object back in data, JSON format and everything, and then I can pass that back to my parent caller. Here in my sort of final results function, I'll do some checks, make sure that the user doesn't already exist and we don't have an error of duplication or something, and then I'll pass back the user data returned by this call here. The other function I have is I've created a function called user by field, and you'll see this is actually not exported, but basically you pick a field like a username or display name or email address or UUID. You give me a value and I'll find the user that matches that. So we get the connection. We first select whatever from the users where the field name is equal to that value. And we don't escape the field name here because that's something we're entering in code, so it's not a user inputted value, so we don't have to worry about escaping that. And then finally we pass back any resulting rows. You'll notice here whenever we get a database connection with the db.db, we make sure we're always at the end releasing it or with the db.end call. So again, we're always closing down that connection. So the people who use this user by field function, I've exported these functions: user by UUID, user by user display name, and then user by email address. So back in our handlers, let's go ahead and look at the register function. Again, there's more code doing error handling than anything else. We first make sure all the values are good, then we do the register on the back end, then we get the user data back from that, and then as part of registering, I go ahead and just make sure that you're logged in, and I just sort of mark you as logged in. And then we send a sort of success response back down to the calling client. And again, we filter the user object to make sure that we don't accidentally send a password down. Login, same thing. I first do some checking, make sure I've got some good values. If we're already logged in, I'll sort of do some work to sort of mention that. Otherwise, the login will be an email address and a password. So first thing we do is we fetch the user by the email address. Then I check the password on the cool user little class we wrote. So let's go back up here. And you'll see here I have a check password, and then I use this bcrypt.compare function, which takes the hash that you generated with bcrypt and the sort of plain text password and tells you whether they're the same or not. So the check password will say if the auth is not okay, then I'll say auth failed. Or if it did work, then what I do is I mark the user as logged in. Great. Like that. So that's the basics of my login system. I need to be able to register a user, and I need to be able to sort of log a user in and check the password. So in the next section, we'll look at the pages and templates we wrote to support this.